My lords, today I'm going to address whether or not hive mind civilizations throughout our galaxy can be defined as psionic, and explore whether there has been any indication that any hive-minded empire has ever displayed even an iota of psionic potential. I believe this is an important question, but while many vehemently stand by the fact that hive minds are psionic, we have to date never seen or detected a hive mind drone or leader with any psionic capabilities. In order to do this, I'm going to break down everything that we know about hive minds, including seeking information from the curators, an analysis of the individual hive-minded empires that we know to have existed, and will even speak to an enigmatic individual named Iggy, who calls himself the Developer. But first, I think it's important to define what a hive mind actually means. Typically, I would assume that many of you would agree that a hive mind refers to a collective consciousness, i.e., all the minds within this collective are linked together in some manner, which is potentially psionic, and the individuals within the hive are unable to operate as independent drones with any real level of coherence. This definition comes with the larger question of whether or not there is an overarching intelligence above the collective consciousness, which may be unclear depending on the hive. How are they linked together? Well, that's a question that we'll get to later. However, a hive mind could also be loosely defined as a eusociality, and this is the behaviour that we see in some insects, such as honeybees. This is defined by the following characteristics: cooperative brood care, including the care of offspring from other individuals, overlapping generations with colony of adults, a division of labour into reproductive and non-reproductive groups. The division of labour creates specialised behavioural groups within an animal society, and often these are called castes. Eusociality is distinguished from all other social systems because the individuals of at least one caste usually lose the ability to perform behaviour characteristics of the individuals in another caste. Now, we know that hive mind empires operate in a caste system, with leaders, specialists and drones. It's not unreasonable that the empires we see display hive tendencies fit into this category. And they are, in reality, not linked by any form of psionic or subspace communication. They are simply without individuality, hyper-focused on their specific role in society, and thus they do what they must for the hive. Furthermore, there is absolutely no reason that a hive mind cannot use technology to communicate across vast distances, akin to a regular organic species. The point that I labour here is that it is not a requirement in my eyes that a hive mind has to be innately psionic. There are clearly alternative options. In any case, both of these descriptions, I believe, are reasonable to apply to the hive minds that we see throughout our galaxy. But let's explore deeper, as we still need to discuss whether or not hive minds display psionic tendencies. Fortunately, the curators have done some work on this topic for us. They describe hive-minded empires as having a government that operates as a single consciousness, with the population having no individual desires beyond fulfilling the needs of the hive mind. Furthermore, the curators list the individual nodes that hive-minded empires appear to have, and there are 4 distinct nodes. The regulatory node is where the counter of emergent deviant consciousness is made. The cognitive node is where the hive develops their understanding of the world around them. The growth node is where important hive decisions are made, and the legion node is where decisions concerning galactic expansion is made. According to the curators, every spacefaring hive mind has these traits. Perhaps like the bees, they have caste systems in government and have specific castes to take care of specific tasks, which is where the nodes come into play. But we have more detail. According to the curators, hive minds operate as a single organism more than a state. The population has no free will and acts as an extension of the hive mind itself, much like the limbs of a body. When cut off from the mind, the drones become comatose and will eventually wither and die. Any free individuals on the planets owned by the mind are driven away, killed, or simply treated as prey to feed the collective. Furthermore, the curators have categorized specific hive traits, and some of which are important for this report. In alphabetical order, these are autonomous drones. The hypermetabolic drones evolved in this colony possessed increased autonomy while decision-making, and situational assessments. They do require an increased intake of digestible materials. Empath. This hive can reach out and touch the minds of others, giving them a glimpse of the hive mind that will help them understand. One Mind. This hive takes care not to let its drones diverge. Pooled Knowledge. A hive mind's autonomous drones frequently share knowledge through direct links, bypassing the hive mind's slower registry processes. Subspace EFAPs. The hive mind's cognitive processes exist partially in subspace, reducing the impact of time and space on the actuation of its drones. And finally, Wild Swarm. A highly adaptive colony, this hive mind has evolved into a symbiotic relationship with void-born biological organisms in its home system. Separate minds, they work together to achieve common goals. Now I think that some of these descriptions 100% point to hive minds being psionic in nature, specifically subspace EFAPs, empath and pooled knowledge. But conversely, autonomous drones suggest that drones can be developed that operate outside of the hive mind. Are these then more like bees, simply aware of their task and focused on completing it? I think it's now fitting to discuss specific examples of hive minds and explore whether they show psionic capabilities or not. And we'll start with the Ix'Idar Star Collective. This was the first hive-minded empire we came into contact with. We studied their records and histories, and they had the following to say. And so, at the dawn of time we awoke. The mind studied our surroundings with a multitude of eyes. We moved as one, building shelters for the drones, developing industry, researching new technologies, and harnessing the resource of the land. Soon we had grown to encompass the entire world. A small number of autonomous drones were created to serve as independent agents. These more formidable drones had the capacity for limited free thought, but were still bound to the will of the mind as any other instruments. As we achieved complete dominion over our homeworld, the mind became aware of other worlds orbiting other suns. The most intelligent of our autonomous drones devised new methods of travel, enabling us to cross vast distances between the stars, and our collective will soon grow. I think that the key takeaways from these records are the descriptions of the hive mind as an individual. It built shelters for its drones, it developed industry, but it also then describes using autonomous drones, and one is to consume that this is somewhat outside of the control of the singular mind, and yet still bound to it. A little like the bees. It is autonomous in its decision making, but it is still bound to its ultimate goal, which is to further the progress of the hive. Regarding this description, I would argue that this may represent a very weak psionic entity, if one at all. It describes the mind controlling its movements, but it does not have the strength or capacity to control all of its drones. Perhaps there is a collective consciousness here, under a central mind, but it is just in the very early stages of development. Conversely, if this hive mind was psionic, then why would it describe itself as having different intellects within its drones? Surely they would all operate at the same capacity. Odd indeed. The next hive mind to discuss is the Larionessi. The Larionessi are the remains of a plantoid hive mind empire, who cloned themselves and stored their entire surviving empire in an underground facility to escape a bacterial plague which was used as a genocidal weapon by another empire, in an attempt to end a long-running war. The plague worked, but the Larionessi survived. The Larionessi specifically mention that the plague paralysed their neural network. Now they don't use the word psionic, but perhaps they don't understand what that is. A plague that decimates their neural network feels to me like it was disrupting the hive's ability to mentally communicate with one another. Next we have SmeeGibb. This is the hive mind that we met during our search for Captain Ness. There is no evidence for SmeeGibb acting as a psionic or not. We spoke to the same individual each time, and Captain Ness spoke of it as an individual itself. I don't think SmeeGibb obviously fits into one category or another for this report. The Brainslugs. The Brainslugs that will latch onto volunteer hosts operate as a hive mind. We know that they have the ability to communicate with their host, which makes sense given that they're wrapped around their brainstem. There is, however, no record of the slugs being able to communicate with one another when attached to a host, nor do they give this capability to the host. Other than the fact that we know that they're brain slugs, we don't really understand how their hive mind works. Next we have the unnamed Hive Mind Empire from the dig site designated Anyone Home. Here we have a Hive Mind Empire who has a collective death and rebirth cycle, innate to their genome. They hatch en masse, they get to work building cities and so on, but then at some sort of biological clarion call, they birth a pod and die on top of it, fertilizing the next cycle of the hive. At some point, for an unknown reason, the hive began to question the cycle of life and death, and the record states that this kernel of doubt spread through the hive at a terrifying speed until they decided in unison that the last crop of seed pods should not be planted, but burned. This ended their entire civilization. As with other hive minds, there are no literal records of psionic activity, but a latent psionic connection could explain how this singular thought spread so quickly and took so much hold throughout the hive. Progenitor hives. Progenitor hives have gained evolutionary advantage through semi-independent leaders. These offspring greatly improve overall proficiency, but they do require constant oversight. The progenitor hive appears much more of a singular mind than a regular hive-minded empire. It could not manage alone, and thus produced menial drones to assist it. It is, sadly, like the other hives, unclear how it communicates with its drones. It may use a psionic link, or the eusocial example, but it is not clear either way. The Baol. The Baol are perhaps the best example we have of a hive mind that may have actually been psionic. We know that the Baol was a plantoid hive mind of billions of units that work together as a whole, like the leaves, roots, and branches of a tree. The Baol used biocomputers intended for immature members of the species, not yet ready to receive the full range of the hive mind's neural connection. We know that this computer helped to teach the saplings prior to connecting to this neural network, and this goes further when we discovered that the Baol have an organ that allows them to communicate neurologically over great distances. This is called a subspace EFAPS, which we know that other hive minds have developed, but importantly, I don't think all hive minds have developed. Thus, I believe that the Baol were able to use latent psionics to communicate with the rest of the hive mind, but I do think that there is a clear difference between the Baol Empire and other hive-minded empires. Cyborg Hives. Cyborg Hives, as far as we're aware, have no psionic capabilities at all, and this is a perfect example of a hive mind using technology to replicate faster than light mass communication. And we know from the study of organics that any form of cybernetic or synthetic enhancement appears to completely block psionic powers from manifesting, or go as far to remove them entirely. It does occur to me that if we ever wanted to decimate a population of psionics, we could simply give them cybernetic implants. But back to the point in hand, cybernetic hives are clearly not psionic at all. The Prethoyrn Scourge. Like many other hive minds, it's not clear to me whether the Scourge is psionic or not, but we are aware that both psionic empires and hive-minded empires can at least open a dialogue with them. It's important to note that the dialogue is identical irrespective of the communication method, but I think it's important to stress that just because you can commune with them psionically doesn't necessarily make them psionic. It could simply mean that psionics are able to understand them in a manner that others cannot. The hive-mind link is harder to explain, but it doesn't necessarily have to be down to a latent psionic capability. Hive-minded first contact primitive events. We know from the study of a primitive hive mind that some psionic hives do exist. We found a primitive hive in a state of technological advancement resembling the Stone Age. But interestingly, upon abducting a drone, the other drones immediately became innately aware. We dissected this drone, and it became clear that it had the ability to communicate trans-dimensionally. We think that this hive had the trait of the subspace EFAPS. A hive world. Perhaps the most clear and obvious sign, and if I may go as far to say, the only reference to hive minds actually being psionic at all, is found in the curator description of a hive world. The curators describe the hive world as a giant living organism, psionically connected with the hive mind that shaped it. Any beings not part of the hive that set foot here will be attacked by the very terrain itself. And that finishes the segment discussing the hive minds, and what we know of them, and whether or not they are psionic. At this point, where do you stand, my lords? I'll give you a summary of my thoughts at the end, But we have one last thing to address, and that comes from a shadow broker of information. This broker calls himself a developer, and we don't quite understand the reference. His name is Iggy, and I questioned him on the matter. Iggy had the following to say. I directly asked if Hive Minds were psionic, to which he responded, very, very latently, and he continued. Essentially, it's how they manage to become one across a galaxy when they are spread out so far. Something most hives develop when they subsume their home planet is to store parts of their overmind inside of the shroud, linking all drones together galactically. Now I don't want to say all because the player should always be allowed to make their own designs and backstories for their own empires. That is how we write the events. Next, I asked if hives could access the shroud, to which Iggy responded, subconsciously, yes, but intentionally, no. But one day when they can mechanically, they should. My final query was whether or not I could use this information in my report, to which I was told yes, as long as I made it clear that it's not a hard rule and instead a common similarity. So in final summary, my lords, are Hive Minds psionic? I think that the truth is somewhere in between. Yes and no. I'm confident that hives can have the ability to be psionic, but not all hive minds are psionic. Or perhaps they are psionic to different levels of degree. Something I've not touched on is whether or not hive drones are capable of having souls, and whether or not that has an impact on one's ability to manipulate the shroud. It could very well be that cybernetic enhancements damage not only the body, but the spirit or soul, thus preventing it from accessing the shroud altogether. Or, since hive minds, as far as we know, have no soul to begin with, they cannot access the shroud in the same manner, despite potentially being latently psionic. And that brings my thoughts to a close. I hope this report was entertaining and informative. If you want me to address other topics of this nature in a similar manner, then please let me know in the comments. And as ever, if you want to hear more from me, please click the video on screen now.